Hello, my name is Mary Ann Buchanan. Welcome to 5 Reasons to Consider Selling Now. I'm founder of REA Match and the moderator of today's webinar. Our guests today are Tony Whitbeck, CEO of KMG and Advisory Legacy, and Todd Doherty, M&A expert at KMG and Advisory Legacy. I've asked Tony and Todd to join us today as they bring synergies to the needs of our REA Match subscribers. KMG and Advisor Legacy provide firm valuations, buyer vetting, and a buyer bidding platform that will create the opportunity for you to select the best suited buyers and obtain a better price for your firm. So we know as potential sellers, best practices suggest that you envision your future, get a sound valuation, vet several potential buyers, and try to maximize your return while ensuring that your staff and your clients are in good hands going forward. For those of you who've attempted or accomplished this, you know it's considerable work and it requires a team with the knowledge and skills to guide you through the process. I want to thank you for coming today, and we want you to be part of this this discussion. This is important work. So you can follow other attendees and share with your own followers on Twitter. Use the hashtag and handles you see on the screen. So at REA Match, at Key Management Group, and hashtag Succession. We'd also really like to hear from you. So you see up in the upper right corner there, you can ask questions, share comments, challenge our ideas. So use that question and answer panel on the right side at any time during the webinar. So if you have a question and it comes to mind, just pop it in there. We'll either address it at that point or we will get to it at the end. It's always good to sort of test this out. So if one or two of you could just test, put in your question box where you're calling from. So then I always know people can hear me. All right, can you guys, anybody put an answer in? Let's see. I see no one. There we go, Southborough, Massachusetts. Whew, Northern Virginia, thank you. Always have that fear that we're not being heard, so that's great. Thanks so much. You're listening using your computer speaker system by default. So if you'd prefer to join over the phone, you just select telephone, and the information is there. And your lines are muted automatically with webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and it'll be up on the webinar page at REA Match by tomorrow. So be sure and let your colleagues know the session's recorded, and they can listen to it at their convenience from the webinar page. What I want to do briefly is tell you a little bit about REA Match. REA Match has 3 offerings that provide financial advisors solutions for succession planning and growth. So the REA Match platform offers low-cost self-service solutions. You search for free and pay to connect anonymously and securely. REA Match concierge consultants can provide personalized advice to crystallize your advisory firm's vision and goals and create an action plan. And then we will conduct the search on your behalf. Not too long ago, we created Concierge Consulting Lite, and that provides the same foundational work as the full service. We help you articulate your vision and goals, and we create an action plan for you, but then you conduct the search. So it's a lower cost service between the full white glove concierge service and the self-service REA Match platform. So that, what we want to do is give you the tools you need to begin an effective and efficient search. And of course, we're always available for additional consulting if needed. Our goal is to bring advisors the most efficient tools and excellent information so you can make the best decisions for the succession and growth of your firm. REA Match has over 4,300 subscribers from 49 states that manage in excess of $450 billion of AUM. I want to share with you the results of the questions that you answered when you registered for the webinar. It's always good to know who's in the room with you. So 19% of you are market dominators. So that means your firm manages in excess of $500 million of AUM. 35% of you are ensemble firms with 2 or more advisors and less than 500 million of AUM. 22% are solo practitioners. 61% of you have contingency plans, okay? And 48% have succession plans in place. Now, we know that that's above the national average, which is about 30%. So congratulations to those of you who do have those succession plans in place. And this is a bit of a self-selected group. Those who are seeking the solutions or seeking to improve their solutions often have these things. So you are above average. So important to know that. Now what I'd like to do is hand over the discussion to Tony Whitbeck and Todd Doherty to dive into our content. So let me go ahead and do that. Todd, let me see if, Tony, rather, let me try this, and let's see if you have control.
Oh, Marianne, I'm not seeing the slides move forward.
Okay.
You might want to check with your.
Okay, there we go. I redid it. How's that?
Looks good.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marianne. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your group. Are you hearing any echo, or are you okay?
You know, I'm actually hearing an echo. So I don't know if you've got your speaker on your computer as well as your phone. That potentially. So maybe choose one or the other. Now test it now, Tony. See how you're doing.
Okay. How's this?
Much better.
All right. Well, I'm going to use the computer instead of the headset here. So sorry about that.
No worries. No worries.
All right. So again, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Key Management Group really is a full-service consulting firm to the financial services industry. We offer a whole host of services regarding practice management, outsourcing, and human resources. And here today, we're going to be talking more about acquisition and legacy planning services. We do business valuations for firms all across the United States. We do in excess of 350 a year. We have a turnkey continuity plan to help people protect their practice in the event of death and disability. We offer a deal-making service to help people who have found each other strike a deal. We have an escrow service, and this is used when financing of a practice acquisition happens. We help people buy and sell practices, and we have an elite buyer program. And so today, what we're going to talk about is the 5 reasons to consider selling your practice now, especially if you're looking to retire in maybe the next 5 years. And so that really applies to our acquisition and legacy planning services. Marianne, if you could move the slide forward. I don't have control.
Sure. Sorry about that.
So what we have found is that most financial advisors don't retire when they should. This may or may not be a surprise to you. But what we found is that when we ask people when they're thinking about retirement, they typically say, I'm looking to retire in the next 5 years. And so Marianne, if you could again proceed
Sure.
to the next slide. And it's interesting because when we ask people when they're going to retire, when they say 5 years, I've contemplated why are they saying 5 years? What I've concluded is that 5 years is not too far away where they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And 5 years is not too close. And they're not in a position where they actually have to make a decision right now or pull the trigger on deciding if they're going to retire. Because this is a really emotional process. People have oftentimes been working with their with their clients who are like family. They've been doing it for 15, 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. And so the thought of giving up their practice and giving up those relationships is oftentimes difficult. And frankly, a lot of advisors stick around a little too long when in reality, if they wanted to do what was best for their clients, they would develop their successor and hand that relationship off. Next slide, please. What's scary though is that the overwhelming majority of advisors, and even those that are less than 5 years from retirement, still don't have a succession plan. When you look at this graph, and this was a study that was done by Accenture in 2013, 59% of those advisors that were less than 5 years away from retirement did not know who their successor would be, but they knew it would be someone outside of their practice, so it wasn't someone internal. And 30% said they would go to a designated non-partner successor. So they know who it is, but it's not a partner within their firm. And again, these are folks that are less than 5 years away from retirement. Next slide, please. There was also a study that was done to identify the psychological reasons that prevent small business owners, and most financial advisors are small business owners, that prevent them from planning for their retirement. So the title of the study was Family Business, the Role of Goal Adjustment Capacities. And so here were the 4 reasons that were, or at least 4 observations that were made in the study. So business owners are often resistant to retirement, number 1, because it's their inability to let go of their work goals. You know, they say, well, I'm just going to give it 1 more year. I know I can reach my goal, or 2 more years. And so they keep trying to hit those work goals. What else was interesting is that age does not correspond to the readiness to retire. So someone at 65 was no more ready to retire than someone at 55. And a lot of it had to do with the inability to let go of work goals. But the other is number 3, which is the lack of setting alternative goals. So it was really important in the study for someone to make a decision to retire to have other goals. So if there's no goals, there's no action. But if you have something to retire to, not retire from, you're more likely to make the decision to find your successor and to pass on your practice. And then number 4 is the trust in the successor is highly correlated to one's ability to retire. So if you don't know who your successor is going to be, you're not going to take any action. But if you have that person that you like, that is a good fit, that you trust, it's much easier for you to make the decision to retire. Next slide, please. When you look at this graph, or the 5-year plan, as we talked about, it's generally based on some assumptions that frankly aren't necessarily accurate. And when you look at this, people always say, well, why would I retire when I can just work 4 more years and get the same amount of money? So in this example, let's assume that you have $500,000 of annual revenue, and let's say the purchase price is 2 times recurring, or 2 times the gross revenue, and that would put the practice value at $1 million. So the argument is, well, why don't I just keep working? And in 4 years, if I make $500,000 a year, I'll make $2 million when I can only sell my practice for $1 million. Well, there's some problems with these assumptions. Number 1 is people oftentimes underestimate the value of their practice when they're considering retirement because they haven't done a valuation. 2 is that the continued revenue is often overestimated because as you get older, as we get tired, we don't want to do the same activities that have gotten us to where we're at today. In other words, oftentimes the client service starts to slip. We see our clients less often, and we simply don't have the energy to do the marketing that we used to do in order to bring in new clients. So if you're getting to that point where you're getting tired and you're looking to retire, chances are you're not going to be able to maintain that same revenue. And the third thing is that most people aren't aware that there's some different blended exit strategies that they could use. Perhaps sell and stay on for a few years, or merge and transfer the business over time. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. It's not uncommon for us to help people sell a portion of the practice. They may sell 80% of the practice, but keep 20% of the clients that they really enjoy working with. This gives them the ability to slow down versus completely get out of the business. So that's setting the stage, and what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Todd. Todd Doherty is our Director of Acquisition and Legacy Planning, and Todd's going to take us through the 5 reasons why someone might want to consider selling now. You forward the slide, and Todd, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. As Tony mentioned, it's widely believed that the previous slide and that the consideration that it represents is really the primary reason that most advisors have potentially delayed their retirement. Specifically, advisors have been enjoying a pretty comfortable period of a very strong market really since the end of 2009, and they've had a comfortable time of their clients being content during that period as well. And as a result of that, they haven't really felt the pain that sometimes is necessary to create the change and cause people to want to start planning or to execute their exit strategy. Unfortunately, it's really akin to making an emotional decision versus an informed decision. And so today what I'm going to present is some real considerations that are very timely that can hopefully help you make an informed decision, and hence the 5 reasons why you might consider retiring now if you're within 5 years of retirement, or if you're perhaps even past the point where you might have normally retired. The other understanding, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but I wanted to mention it, is the idea of retiring and monetizing equity don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. And I know Tony mentioned that a little bit as well. We're seeing more and more advisors who recognize that it makes sense to monetize the equity in their practice for various reasons, some of which we'll cover today. But maybe they're not ready to step away and they still have a passion for serving clients, and that's perfectly okay, becoming more and more common. But really the key consideration there is monetizing the equity while the value is strong, even if you choose to stay. So let's jump into the 5 reasons. The first of which, and these are not necessarily in order of significance. There's different significance for different items, and it probably partially depends on the advisor as well. But the first one, coincidentally, may be the most significant item of the 5 list, and that is simply supply and demand. If you could advance that slide, please. Many advisors or many people have heard over the years about the impact of the age wave, as they refer to it, and from the book of the same title. And that has to do with the retirement of the baby boomer generation, who own the majority of small businesses in this country. And in fact, the year 2020 has been estimated to represent an all-time record in the United States for business transitions. I believe our own industry, for the reasons that we've already discussed, is a little bit behind that curve probably, and I would estimate, based on our own experience, that likely we're about 2 to 3 years behind the curve, and maybe the year 2023 or so will represent an all-time record in our own industry for practice transitions. It's also believed that as much as 40% of advisors will retire between now and the year 2030, which represents the end of the baby boomer generation retiring approximately, or at least the end of the majority of what they referred to as that age wave. Those advisors also control the majority of the assets in the industry, and that's a significant consideration as well. And as you'll see on the next slide, the problem or the challenge is compounded because we don't have a younger generation of advisors who are coming into the industry, and that's a significant problem as well. I think if you could just advance that one more time, please.
Sure.
If you look at the statistic on the left-hand side of this slide, it's very, very telling. So the industry has not invested in the next generation of advisors, and we'll talk a little bit about where they may be investing. And as a result of that, and obviously for other reasons as well, there are actually more advisors over the age of 70 than there are under the age of 30. And I think that statistic in itself really says a lot. If you advance that slide one more time, You'll see the impact when we move that group forward. Oh, I think we missed that one. So if you move that group forward by 5 years,
is that it, Todd?
We didn't capture that. Sorry about that. That's okay. We'll just go on. You can see a really significant impact in the overall average age of advisors moving forward, and it's still having a very small relative group of younger advisors who will be able to acquire those practices that are going to be sold between now and the year 2030. So we had to go back into our high school economics archive for this slide, and basically we wanted to illustrate, the dynamics of simple supply and demand, and that's really what's significant about those factors of a record number of advisors retiring, a small number of advisors who are going to be able to purchase practices. Another dynamic that we've witnessed over the last 5 years or so is that many of the buyers in our industry, if you will, who have been very active in buying practices, they kind of reach a bit of a critical mass where, they can't continue to buy practices, and many of them have found, that they kind of reach their capacity for managing that size of a practice. So you can add that to the mix of this as well. But the ultimate outcome is that we'll have a diminishing demand, and that's not to say there won't be sufficient demand to sell a practice. Certainly there will, but it won't be as robust as it has been over the last 5 to 7 years. And over the next 10 years, we'll have an increasing supply. So you can see on this in this slide where supply and demand meet, again, simple economics, that's where the price is going to fall. And it's very likely as a result of that trend all by itself that we're going to see a decrease in price paid over that time frame of the baby boomer generation retiring. I mentioned that there's not a large investment in the industry going into developing that next generation, and that's been pretty clear. If you could advance that slide, please. And one of the reasons, and in our research was a little bit of a surprise to me, but I think it's significant if you think about the future of the industry and maybe where things are going, or the shift of the focus, is some firms, as opposed to investing in the next generation, are actually investing in the robo-advisor, as we refer to it, side of the industry, and really relying more on technology than on human resources. So those factors, as you can imagine, all create really an increased emphasis on that simple factor of supply and demand, and it's likely that will become more significant as we move forward in time. Reason number 2 is that values have been really at record high levels. One of the things that we've seen over the past few years, or actually probably the past 5 years, is that we've had a steady increase in value. And even though demand has certainly enhanced practice value, practice growth has been the most significant factor in the increase in valuation. Our average valuation today is north of $1,500,000, which I think is quite a milestone. It wasn't that long ago that an average practice value was under $1 million, and then we hit that milestone, and then shortly thereafter we're again all the way up to almost $1,600,000 for an average practice. And again, the majority of that increase in value has been growth, or that's been the most heavily weighted factor, probably followed by an increase in recurring revenue. I would say that's probably the second most heavily weighted factor. Obviously there's been multiple contributions to that growth. You've had rollovers from clients' retirement accounts. You've had the growth of the market. Certainly we've seen some new records set over that time frame. And acquisitions have fueled that growth as well. Interestingly enough, though, we have seen a decline in growth, actually quite a sharp decline in growth that started really immediately at the beginning of the year 2016, which is interesting given that, the market at the time, and still has, been in record territory. Practices have not experienced that growth since 2016 on average. We were tracking an average growth rate fairly consistently of between 10 and 14%. And by the beginning of 2017, the average growth rate that we track was all the way down to less than 1%. And today it's only recovered slightly to around 3.5%. So in spite of the market strength, we've already seen what we thought would happen, and practice growth has declined pretty sharply. The other thing that's very clear in our valuation process is advisors who are within 5 years of retirement almost exclusively are not growing, and it's often by choice. They're not pushing the pedal too hard. They're not marketing anymore. They're not putting in the hours that they used to, and so forth. And so the majority of those practices, in fact, are shrinking, as Tony pointed out earlier in the presentation. Reason number 3 is the cost of capital has also been extremely favorable. Again, in this case, in record low territories, which has certainly enhanced the price of practices. What many advisors and people in our industry are not aware of is that we've really seen a shift in how practices are financed, how the acquisitions are financed over the last 5 or 6 years or so. It used to be that most deals were seller financed, so the seller would hold the note and act as the bank, and in that case, the seller would receive, say, a 20% down payment, and then they might carry a note for an average of 5 years, and also accept the risk of carrying that note. In some cases, they might have an earnout, which is also means that the seller is carrying the majority of the risk. That's changed significantly today. Most deals are funded by banks who now specialize in our industry, and they're very adept at putting deals together and providing the funding for our industry. And that's quite a different scenario. With bank financing, really both parties benefit, I would argue. The seller gets paid the majority of the sale price at closing because that's how the bank pays. And the buyer gets a much longer note of 10 years versus a typical 5-year seller finance note, which greatly enhances their cash flow during the debt service period. The downside to that, of course, is that it's very closely tied to interest rates, and most rates for SBA loans, for example, are approximately prime plus 2 or 3%. So the rate has impacted an increase in price. So if a buyer is using an earnings-based model to determine what the correct price is, and based on their net cash flow, any increase in the interest rate is going to have a downward pressure on price. And as you can see by these graphs on this slide, we are already seeing an increase in rates. We have anticipated that. We certainly didn't anticipate rates going lower. And again, if we're looking forward over the next few years, it's probably likely that we'll see a continued increase. And it's very rate sensitive, actually. The cost of the loans is not, frankly, it's not cheap. And buyers are sensitive to the interest that they're paying and to the cost of those loans. While they'll still continue to use them, I believe, they will probably lower their price with any rate increase on average. The next item, and I think this is probably the one that's closest to home for advisors, something that you may feel on a daily basis. I hear this quite often, and I'm sure a lot of you on the call today have experienced this very personally. And I would say this is especially impactful for advisors who are solo practitioners, and so they're having to wear all the hats of running the practice and being the practitioner and so forth. And it's it's become extremely difficult. In fact, many advisors have told me they feel like they're being forced out of the industry, and the industry is really favoring larger practices and larger team structures. And it really comes down to, I would say, two different areas. One is regulations or compliance becoming more stringent, more complex, and the other is really the use of technology. And it's, running a practice today requires someone who's very adept at technology. And so, everything from marketing to client service and so forth is very technology driven today. As you can see on the slides, the days of the filing cabinets stuffed with with client account paperwork are really over, and most of that is going to be electronic. Certainly, if we think about these two areas and what's changed, the rate of change is likely to actually increase over time. That's been the case with technology, certainly, and probably will continue to be with regulations and compliance as well. So again, if you're a solo practitioner, this is a big factor. It's very close to home. And for many, it is a motivating factor that really tells people, I think it's time, to move on, hand this over to a younger generation who, is more used to operating business in that fashion. Number 5, and this is also, I would rate this as close to equal to the first item on our list of supply and demand, and that is our clients are aging. Most of the clients and most of the assets belong to that baby boomer generation. And if you could forward that slide, please. So we're starting to see a fairly significant impact on client age and the value of a practice. And I would say this is another area that specifically applies to solo practitioners again, because the age of the clients will tend to reflect that of the advisor, perhaps a little bit older in some cases. And if you don't have a younger generation of advisors in the practice bringing in new clients and more challenging finding new clients who are younger and actually have assets, then likely the average age of the clients is increasing each year. Our current metrics for client age are an average of 60 for all clients in the practice and an average of 65 for more high value or affluent clients. What we're starting to see, and this is fairly significant, is a number of practices who I would say have reached a tipping point in respect to their client age and the impact on the value of the practice. And basically where that is around an average age of 70 years old. So if you're getting close to an average age of 70 for your clients, or if your higher value or affluent clients are near or at an average age of 70, the practice value will decrease substantially. And the reason, or the primary reason for that, if it's not very obvious, is that it would be very difficult to assign a growth rate to that group of clients. So like the likelihood is that, you're going to have net asset outflows, you'll have clients passing away, and asset retention is very, very low in our industry. So likely you're going to have a declining or a shrinking practice with an older client group. And the growth of a practice is a key consideration in value. If you can't assign a growth to the client group, then the value will be much, much lower than it would otherwise be. So if it is the case that you do have an older group, it's another very, very strong consideration in why you would want to sell, certainly sooner than later, if not, tomorrow or as soon as possible. What you can see here is also some interesting data around how practice profitability actually is impacted by the average age of the client. And so if the overall, as the overall average increases, profitability of the practice actually decreases, which is not something that most people might correlate. The primary reason behind that is growth. If you think about the fact that, most expenses of a practice are fixed. If you're not growing, and especially if you're shrinking, then your profitability will decline, and the growth or the lack thereof for a practice is very highly correlated to the age of the clients when they get past a certain point on the average. So to conclude with the 5 reasons, many advisors, again, have delayed retirement. Many have stayed really past the point where they should have, or they should have at least monetized the equity if they still desire to continue servicing clients, which many advisors certainly do. And these 5 reasons, I think, are just more data points or things that can help you make more of an informed than an emotional decision. One of the things that we do in our own service to help people sell and transition their practice is a process that we call advisor legacy. Tony touched on that in the introduction, but I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into the process. So we're a little bit unique in the industry in that we represent the sell side of the deal, exclusively so. So we represent the seller and their clients, and we really seek to, make sure that they find the best candidate first, and that's usually the primary motivation for a seller is the fit and handing off their client service legacy, but also put together a very solid deal. So quickly, I'll go through how that process flows just to give you a feel for what our service entails. So the first thing that we do in the advisor legacy process is we work with the seller, understand, what their goals are, motivation, timing, etc. We explain how the process is going to flow, what we'll be doing and what they'll be doing. And we do the majority of the heavy lifting through this process, which is approximately a 4-month time frame from start to finish. The next thing that we'll do is we'll gather data on the practice, quite a bit of it actually, and we'll build a profile of the practice that will be published on our advisor legacy website. And those who are registered as buyers on the site will be notified of that practice for sale and have the ability to express interest in it. What we'll also do is collect a list of names from the selling advisor of people that they want to specifically have participate as potential buyers of the practice, and we'll certainly invite those people directly into the process. We might reach out to the custodians and so forth and get a list of qualified candidates from those folks as well. We really want to start out with a large pool of potentially qualified candidates. Once people have expressed interest in the practice, we'll do an initial vetting on that group. And we're going to take a fairly large group and look to narrow it down to the most qualified candidates of a group of about 10 or so. For those folks, we're going to actually invite them to bid on the practice. And when they are invited, they're going to have access to 2 different areas. One, a number of reports and other information that we will have uploaded to the seller's profile. And 2 is actually the terms of the deal that we're looking for. And so we will have worked with the seller to define those terms. We don't ask for a specific sale price, very specifically so. We want people to make offers that they're comfortable with, given the terms that we're requesting. And by accepting a range of offers, you'll collect or you'll have the ability to capture a higher range of offers in that process. Once the bids have been received, we'll do another round of vetting based on the offers and our initial impression of the fit. Narrow that group down even further to a group of around 5 candidates, and those people we're going to take into an interview process. The reason that we collect bids ahead of the interview is we certainly want to be working with people who are serious, willing to make a correct offer, and we want to, be cautious about how we use the seller's time. The interview process is fairly time-consuming. So we're going to conduct the interviews with the buyer and the seller give the seller a really great opportunity to determine, who is the best fit, who shares their values, client service processes, and so forth. And usually that's, during the interview process, the seller can come away with either having made a decision or narrowed it down to, 2 or maybe 3 candidates at the most. And then we'll conduct some final due diligence to allow them to make a final decision. Once the buyer has been selected, then we help both parties complete the transaction. And there's really 3-4 areas there that are really a point of focus. One, we want to get the formal legal agreements completed, and our attorney provides that. 2, to help work with the banks for the financing side of things. And then 3, and this is very important as well, to help actually plan the transition of the clients. Whatever that looks like, we have many, many best practices in planning and executing client transition to make sure that the clients have the best experience and the least amount of attrition, which certainly could impact the deal. So that, again, is an average of 4-month process. We charge a percentage of the sale price as our fee, and only when the deal is successfully closed, and so we get paid out of the proceeds of the closing normally. As you can see at the bottom, that fee range is from 2 to 6%. So what we would recommend as next steps, or for considering, a potential sale of your practice if you are in that 5-year group, as we've discussed. The first step in really almost any consideration like this is to get a practice valuation. It really gives you a lot of great information to make an informed decision. As Tony mentioned, many people have no idea what it's worth, and they're pleasantly surprised at the value of the practice. So that's certainly a motivating factor in itself. So starting out with the valuation is really, usually the first step that you would take. Secondarily, we would certainly be happy to provide a 30-minute free consultation for you to discuss your goals and to help you, again, make a better informed decision. Quickly on our own valuation process, we use 2 different methodologies of value. We conduct both a market-based analysis where we're comparing the key metrics of the practice to our benchmarks or averages, determining, what the overall quality is, and then how does that compare to previous sales of a similar quality practice. We also use an earnings based analysis or discounted cash flow. And there we're really valuing the future earnings of the business discounted for time. The valuation result is the average of those 2 methodologies. Probably the area where most advisors get the most value from our valuation process is that we will spend 60 minutes with you going through the results. And it's very, very helpful because we can talk about, both how did we arrive at the value, but really maybe more importantly is how do you use all of the information in the deliverable to achieve your goals? And that can be pretty insightful 60 minutes for most advisors. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Tony, and he's going to wrap it up and hopefully open it up to some of your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Todd. If you are interested in buying one of our valuations, you can go to our website. You can see the website address here is keymanagementgrp.com. And then there's a menu across the top. You'll see there's services. The drop down goes to assess your practice, and then you click on the business valuation. And you can learn more about all of our services on this particular website. What I'd like to do now is open it up to some questions for either Marianne, myself, or for Todd. And so I'm going to turn it back to Marianne, and she's going to control who's raising their hands and who's typing in questions. And we have some questions for you in case we don't get a lot of questions from you. So Marianne, I'm going to turn it back over to you and let you control the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tony. And Tony and Todd, thank you both very much. Really insightful discussion on the challenges of, looking at your firm and what the obstacles are to selling. But we do have one question And it's a good one, and so I'm going to read it out loud. This is from Brandon. So he's got, well, let's see. So he actually, you know what, Brandon, this one is really detailed. So I'm going to go ahead and send this directly. This is about a specific sales price and a break even. So I will make sure that Tony and Todd see your specific question and answer it, because I think what we want to do is get into sort of more higher level questions, but this is a very, very good sense. And basically the overarching challenge is, you know, how does the seller maximize his revenue? And, you know, that's the kind of thing that in a discussion with Tony and Todd, we can look at assessing some of the issues. So great, thanks, Brandon. Brandon responded perfect. So now Adam has a question, which is, what are some of the issues you run into with financing? So Tony, Todd, who wants to take that?
I'm sorry, can you read that question again? I didn't hear the last part of it.
Sure. What are some of the issues you run into with financing?
I'll take that one. This is Todd. To be honest with you, we don't run into a lot of issues with financing, and that it's interesting. You know, what the banks look at is the cash flow and the ability of the net cash flow to pay the debt service. The way that they do that is actually combining the cash flow of both the buyer's practice and the seller's practice. And because most practices do have strong cash flow, it's very rare that there are challenges in the buyer being approved for financing. In the few instances where I have seen issues, it was either fairly limited. So it was either that perhaps the buyer had too much acquisition debt service on the books already. That's been one common challenge for buyers who are very active. The other issue would simply be that the buyer, either personally or professionally or both, was highly leveraged. But again, you're probably talking about only, you know, less than 5 instances over the many years that we've been doing that I have not seen a buyer get approved.
The only other thing that I would add to that is the fact that if a borrower has had a bankruptcy in the last 10 years, most of the banks that are in this space aren't going to lend to someone with that bankruptcy. If it's been more than 10 years and it's their credit score is fine now, then there's a decent chance that they would get financed. But that typically has been a hurdle for bankruptcies less than 10 years.
And I'd like to add to that, just the, Adam, in the past 10 years, the options for getting financing for advisory firms has really grown. Live Oak Bank is one of them. So what happens is the banks actually specializing in the advisory space lending. And so they are very educated and understand our business, as opposed to trying to go to your local bank and get funding. You have to start with defining what an RIA is, right? The bank, there's specialty banks out there, and that's been a huge help. I know that Todd and Tony have worked with them as well as I have. So that's there are a lot of options out there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Marianne. And I would just emphasize that point. I would really say do not go to a local bank, or do not, have a buyer who's going to go to a local bank. I can't tell you how many times we've had buyers who have said that, my local bank, they love me. And that's probably true. They said, no problem, we'll be approved, no problem, and so forth. But when it goes into underwriting, as Marianne communicated, they don't understand our industry and they're not used to making cash flow loans. And so I don't remember, for the many, many, many people who have gone down that path, maybe 1 or 2 actually funding a deal, but I'm not even sure that it was that many, to be honest with you. So you really have to work with a handful of banks who look at our industry as a vertical market and really understand it well, as she pointed out.
Yeah, very good.
I would add there's an additional risk of using a local bank in that oftentimes you don't find out that you're getting declined until you're getting ready to close and you've now been through 2-3 months worth of work. And then your seller is going to be pretty upset when all of a sudden either you can't buy it or it's going to be another 60 to 90 days to go through the process with a bank that knows what they're doing. So there's a much higher chance of losing the deal for the buyer, or if you're a seller, losing your buyer when they try to go to a bank that doesn't really specialize in this industry.
Okay, very good point, very good point. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? All right. Well, how about, what do you think, guys? Do you want me to do a poll? I've got a couple of polling questions. What do you think?
I think that would be great. I'd be very interested in this, learning a little bit more about our audience. I think we have 2 or 3 pretty basic questions, and if they would take the time to just answer those questions on the screen, it'd be nice to see who's all on the phone with us.
Great, great. So, guys, if you've had come look at your top of your screen, we've got a poll for you. Have you had your firm valued within the last 24 months? So we know when we go to consider selling our firm, that's definitely step 1, right? So if you could just take a second, we've got 38% that have voted, 54. We'll keep it open just a couple seconds more. This is an easy yes, no. All right, thank you. 5 more seconds and I'll close the poll. Yeah, so this is one of the things, and you'll see from this answer. All right, I'm closing the poll. So what you can see is that 89% of you haven't had a valuation yet. And the reality is it's difficult to know where to go for this. And this is part of why I wanted to invite Tony and Todd and Key Management Group here, because there's some valuation services that are very, very expensive and may not be appropriate for where you are. Some you may not feel is strong enough. And so I feel like this is down the middle of the fairway, solid quality and affordable pricing and good counseling, and I want to thank Todd and Tony again for coming, because if you have a need to get your firm valuated, I would encourage you to reach out to them. Any thoughts on the valuation question, guys?
Frank, this is Tony. Frankly, I'm a little surprised it's as high as it is, that 89% have not had it valued, but I guess I would encourage everyone to get their practice valued, even if they're not looking to sell today, because you want to judge how well you're doing at growing the value of the practice and knowing which levers you should be pushing on to grow the practice. And so people will do evaluation for typically 3 reasons. One is going to be for equity management. The second is going to be for continuity planning to protect in the event of death and disability, and the third would be for succession planning. And so, we see people doing it primarily for those 3 reasons. Occasionally, we get them for divorce or for estate settlements and things like that. But it's important to know where you're at today and what you need to do to drive the value, or what is your practice worth if you're ready to sell now.
And one of the comments that I would add is, when you think about the value of a practice being most advisors' largest personal asset, or if not, probably one of their larger personal assets. If it was a client of yours and, they had an asset that you were managing that was, on average, as I pointed out, worth $1,500,000, then you certainly would spend the time on behalf of the client managing that asset. You wouldn't, just hope that it works out okay. And not, have the information needed to manage it, or, in this case, to potentially monetize it. And so I think that's a surprise sometimes. And hopefully that's a good parallel that puts it into perspective, that it is a very significant asset. It certainly should be managed and well understood because of, the significance of it.
And I would add to that often advisory firms feel like I only get it valued if I'm going to sell, and they're not ready to sell, so they don't get it valued. And the point that you've made that I just want to underscore is going in to assess where your health is, where are the strengths of your company, where are your areas that you can improve, and how you can then grow the value of your firm with that information that you then have from the valuation.
Absolutely, yeah. And you don't want to, we've seen this over the years, and with other valuation vendors, you don't want to get a deliverable flipped to the page that has the number on it, and that's as far as it goes. Because if that's the case, then you really haven't received the value that you've paid for. There's a lot of great information in a good valuation that can tell you perhaps the best timing of the monetization of the equity, maybe some things that can be improved in a fairly short period of time, and that can be, within 12 months, you can make changes that increase the value. It could show you that your clients are reaching a critical stage in respect to their age, and that you should sell, now, sooner than later, at least. So there's a lot of great information. It's not just about the number that's assigned to the practice, but, really helping you make an informed decision.
No, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Well, let me do one more. We've got a couple. Here's another question for you. Do you plan to retire within the next 5 years? And what I thought was very interesting, so as people go to answer this, what I find very interesting in the presentation, the points that you made, Todd, in your section, was that people say 5 years because that's not too soon that I need to be doing something. It's not too far away. It looks like I'm being responsible. And it's sort of this, so you ask them in year 1, they say 5 years. If you ask them in year 3, they still say 5 years. It's a comfortable spot to answer in. And so it's important to know what impacts, what impact does this have on your life and your value of your firm? Envisioning your future, though, is a big portion of it. So I'm going to close the poll. And let's see what we've got. So 60% of you plan to retire within the next 5 years. So that's very fair. And age is not always someone can be 70. I've spoken to a 70-year-old man the other day, and he said, "Call me in 10 years." And I was like, "Will do." He's just not ready, and that's obviously has a host of challenges to it. But it's important to get quiet and realize, do you envision your future? Do you know what you're retiring to? Which was, again, a point you all made in the presentation. Any other thoughts?
Well, Marianne, one of the surveys or studies that we've referenced in the past is that roughly half of the advisor force is going to retire in the next 7 to 10 years. So there's about 320,000 financial professionals in our industry. And if you think 160,000 of them are going to retire in the next 7 to 10 years, if you go back to reason number 1 that Todd talked about, supply and demand, we're going to have a heck of a lot more supply coming on the market here in the next number of years. And we're not doing a good job of developing the younger folks in the business. And so you're going to see a major shortage in the number of advisors in our industry to meet the demands that are out there. So again, that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion around the 5 reasons to consider selling now, is because we're going to see these demographics change very fast.
That's a good point, Tony. It's a good point. We're coming up on our, we've got 1 more minute just for fun. I want to do one more poll, if you can bear with me here. And this one is easy. Have you identified a successor for your firm? So this is the last question, and after this we will have closing remarks. Okay. A few more thoughts here. It's that can be a successor internally, externally. Sometimes it's it's better to have them documented. Okay, we've got. I think I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. It's and I think that this number is skewed because we have 100% have not identified a successor. So that's obviously a challenge, and that's why you're here on a conference call like this, on a webinar like this, and there are people to help you.
Marianne, it's interesting because that number, while it is large, if you go back to the study I referenced, 59% of people less than 5 years from retirement don't know who their successor is going to be. It's not that far off, and it's up to 89% that don't know, that it's not someone within their own firm. So there's plenty of opportunity here. I think, obviously our RIA match can help find and match those people. Our advisor legacy platform can help find and match those, and we would work together on that. But when I look at all the numbers of, very few people have done evaluation, or very few of the people on the call have done evaluation. Most are 60% looking to retire in the next 5 years, and this sample size, no one has a successor identified. I think there's lots of opportunities to work with both of our firms to help them prepare for the eventual succession and transfer of their client base to the next generation.
I agree. And just wanted to emphasize that you have control as to who you sell your firm to and when you sell your firm to it. It's not going to be, I think sometimes the advisors are afraid to take the first step because they feel like it's going to, I'm going to lose control of this. And the advisors have control of the process all the way through to find the best fit for your clients, your staff, and the highest return we can for your firm. So with that, Tony and Todd, I want to thank you very much. This has been very valuable, very informative. I want to thank our audience for taking the time to join us today for 5 reasons to consider selling now. We are grateful that you're a part of the RIA Match community. So good afternoon, and this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much.